Welcome to Safe and Effective Dare to Question. I'm your host, Nico Lagan, and today I'm joined by the president of Vaccine Choice Canada, Ted Kuntz, to speak about their new book, Dare to Question, A Young Adult's Guide to Vaccination. Love the name, by the way. Love the name.
Thanks, Nico. Nice to see you. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, we have to. You and I have had quite a few conversations in the past, and it seems that's always the best content that's created under the umbrella of Vaccine Choice Canada seems to involve both of us. So we decided starting today that we would meet once a month to talk about what is happening in the world of vaccination. Doesn't sound that right, but whatever is happening around vaccines. So we decided that the first episode would be on the brand new book that you guys released. I have 2 copies right there, which I was reading today. So let's start at the beginning. What do you hope to achieve with a book destined for the youth?
Well, Nico, as you know, this is actually the 3rd book in our series. The first book we were targeting young parents. That was a new parent's guide to understanding vaccination. Our second book was targeting pregnant mothers, and so that's titled as Pregnancy and Vaccination. And so this is our 3rd book, and we're targeting young adults, generally between the ages of 16 and 25. And what we've come to realize is that we need to get to young people, we need to get to young parents before they begin to just rotely start vaccinating their children. The evidence is so compelling now that vaccines cause harm. We can get into that. And most people are completely unaware of that because of the bias that's in our media, in our medical system, in our institutions. And so, we realize that our young people have been seriously misled about the safety, efficacy, and necessity of vaccines. And even more than that, what young people don't understand is that their career choices will be significantly impacted by vaccine mandates, particularly if they're in a career path that involves the medical profession or travel. Those are 2 career paths where vaccine mandates are very common. And what we realized is that our education system now has been seriously, I would suggest, compromised by the pro-vaccine agenda. And there's the curriculum now in our high schools is very much biased in favor of vaccination. There's very little education given to young people to understand informed consent, what that is, that it's actually an ethical and legal responsibility. I would suggest that informed consent doesn't happen with vaccination. It may happen with surgeries and other kinds of medical treatments, but it does not happen with vaccination. And then on top of that, they're including vaccine clinics now in many of our schools. And so our young people are just walking into, I think, the most important medical decision of their life with virtually no ability to actually make a proper decision. Added to that is that every province in Canada has introduced or has passed legislation. Typically, it's called the mature minor legislation that allows health professionals to bypass the responsibility and the right of parents to make medical decisions for their children. And so that legislation deems that a health professional who has their own financial conflict of interest and their own ideological conflict of interest gets to decide if a young person is mature enough to make a medical decision. And that practice began with providing, contraceptives to young people. Then it expanded to abortion. And now it's expanded to vaccination. And then it's expanded even further to this whole gender ideology that a young person can decide that they're in the wrong body. And so parents are being sidelined in critical medical decisions, and I would suggest vaccination is is one of those critical decisions. I'm aware of children as young as 9 years of age that health professionals have deemed to be mature enough to make their own medical decision. And to me, that's not only offensive, it's a violation of parental rights and responsibility, but it's also incredibly dangerous. And so we realized that we had to find a way to try to engage young people. And that's not easy to do. Nico, that's one of the reasons why we've contracted with you to help us get the message out, because you can appeal to a younger audience than most of the audience that I'm involved with. And so this is part of a bigger agenda to, one is facilitate informed consent. And I believe that anybody who actually does their homework is unlikely to continue the journey of vaccination.
You touched on quite a few things that I want to bring back a bit later on in this show, but let's start with something that you said: informed consent. As I'm not a young parent, I'm a parent of a young one. I'll put the young at the right place in the sentence. But as someone that has a young child, I believe that it is my responsibility at my children about informed consent. So why do you guys think you should be doing this? Because the book is all about informed consent and critical thinking. So why do you think that it's your responsibility and not the responsibility of the parents?
Well, it is the responsibility of the parents. The problem is the parents aren't informed either. And I would suggest, Nico, that even our health professionals are not informed, that they too have been misled and deceived. And we talk about that a little bit in the book. And I'm also working on a new book entitled "What I Wish I Would Have Known Before I Vaccinated My Son." And I explain how health professionals are really captured by the vaccine narrative by the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, you can't be accepted into medical school and graduate from medical school without being fully vaccinated. And so that automatically screens out any health professionals that are adverse to that as a standard of practice. And so what we realize is that in general, the public is not informed. If anything, they've been misinformed, and I would suggest they've been intentionally misinformed. They've been deceived. I do think it's the parents' responsibility to educate their children. The problem is they don't have the information either. My hunch would be with this book, Nico, is that it's probably less likely that a young person is going to immediately pick up the book and start to read it. I suspect that the pathway to the young person will likely be a parent or even a grandparent who says, "I'd like you to read this first." And one of the ways that I think that might happen is that, in many cases, grandparents assist their grandchildren to access a higher education. And if the grandparent understands that their right to medical choice, the bodily sovereignty of their grandson or their granddaughter is going to be compromised by a particular career path, I think that they might go to their grandson or granddaughter and saying, "We need to have a conversation before I'm willing to pay for your post-secondary education."
Wouldn't that be the day? Wouldn't that not be the day where parents and grandparents are actually gifting their children's and grandchildren books?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be the day, instead of giving them cell phones? Wouldn't that not be the day? There's a direct quote from your book that I wanted to bring up and let you expand on. It states the vaccine industry takes advantage of mature minor doctrine to justify vaccination under the legal age of consent and intentionally undermines the responsibility of parents to provide medical direction. The current medical culture prioritizes coercion over consent. Just the expression mature minor drives me absolutely ballistic. This is an oxymoron. You cannot be both mature and a minor at the same time. They both have an opposite definition. And as per justice.gc.ca, or official justice government webpage, it says that generally parents are entitled to make treatment decision on their children's behalf. The mature minor doctrine, however, allows children who are sufficiently mature to make their own treatment decision. And depending on the province, a mature minor could be 15 or older. But in Alberta, for example, a minor under the age of 14 may be deemed a mature minor, while in British Columbia, there's no set age. So teenagers are mature enough to decide if they should get vaccinated without the consent of their parents, but they're not old enough to drink alcohol or to vote. Make that make sense.
Yeah, and you've identified something really critical, is that there are a number of provinces, and British Columbia is one of them, where there is no age of consent for a mature minor. And as I indicated, I am aware of a situation where a girl as young as 9 years old was told that she can make her own medical decision, that she didn't have to talk to her parents. And I don't see 9-year-olds who are saying, I really want to get vaccinated, and so I want to do that without my parents' knowledge or consent. What's happening is it's this medical industry, the pharmaceutical industry, that is going into our schools, and they are convincing kids to get vaccinated. And there's not even a conversation about it. If you actually ask how it's done, Nico, it's as crass as this. There'll be an announcement over the loudspeaker saying, all grade 9 students, please report to the gymnasium. Or all grade 9 students, please report to the cafeteria. And you get down there, and there's just tables there with people doing injections, and they simply say to the students, roll up your sleeve. And what if you actually read the documentation on Health Canada's website, they accept that as informed consent, that if you roll up your sleeve, you're complying, you're giving consent. And I think that this is, well, the word I want to say is, I think this is criminal. They are violating the fundamentals of a free society. They're violating the fundamentals of ethical medicine. They know exactly what they're doing, and they don't want to give the information. And I would suggest the reason they don't is because the information doesn't support the narrative. There is now more than 65 vaccinated versus unvaccinated studies that have been conducted over the last decade or so. Every one of those studies, Nico, confirms that unvaccinated children are healthier than vaccinated children. And if parents knew that, if a young person knew that, they would always say, no, I'm not interested in that injection. The problem is they don't know it. And again, I would suggest to you, most health practitioners don't know it either, because they're not taught in medical school what the science actually says about vaccine safety, efficacy, and necessity.
You know, this is where you and I, we've had that conversation before, and you and I might disagree on this one. I think they know exactly what they're doing. They just don't care at the end of the day, because they know better. They've been put on a pedestal for so long that, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. And doctors are one of the people in society, at least used to be one of the people in society, that carries a lot of power, because we assume that they know better from the start. And we did not used to question doctors, like society wise. We didn't really used to question them. Yet in your book, you also have should be able to apply to themselves and to what they believe, because it is 3 simple sentences that are literally 3 words each. You guys refer to it as the 3-legged stool principle. Number 1, is it necessary? Number 2, is it safe? Number 3, does it work? And just like a 3-legged stool, if any leg fails, the stool cannot stand. So you're telling me that people that have at least 5 years of university cannot ask themselves a very simple question. 3 simple questions. Is it necessary? Is it safe? Does it work?
Well, Nico, they don't ask the question, that those fundamental 3 questions, because they're told that it's necessary, it's safe, and it's effective. And they're not taught to question. They're taught to follow, to regurgitate what they're taught in medical school. When you ask doctors what they're trained or what they're taught about vaccination in medical school, they'll tell you, we're taught what the vaccine schedule is. We're taught how to apply multiple vaccines at the same time. So if you're giving 3 or 5 or more vaccines at the same time, and that happens, how to put one in one arm, one in another arm, one in another, one leg, and one in the other leg, as if somehow that makes a difference. I mean, I just find that logic so absolutely bizarre, but that's what they're trained to do. And then the third piece that they're taught is how to deal with parents that are vaccine hesitant, how to convince them that they should just follow the rules. They're not taught about what the ingredients are. They're not taught the science. They're actually not taught what informed consent would look like. They don't know how to do it. And so do I believe that some of the doctors are absolutely know what they're doing? They recognize the harm, and that doesn't matter to them. The financial profit motive is more important to them than the health of children. Yes, I believe there's a small percentage of people within the health system that know exactly what they're doing. I believe most of the doctors are incredibly naive. We like to think that they're smart, and they've admitted to me that they knew. I've had many doctors say to me, Ted, you know more about this topic than I do. And it takes humility for them to admit that. I don't know if I've told you the story, Nico, of a doctor that contacted me during COVID. And he said, Ted, I thought you were a wacko. I had no respect for you, that you're one of those anti-vaxxers. And so I completely dismissed you. And he said, COVID woke me up to the fact that we're being misled, we're being lied to by our own governments, our own regulatory agencies, our own health professions. And when he started to do his homework, he realized that vaccines were neither necessary, safe, or effective. And so he sent me a photograph of a dead crow on a plate. And the subject line in his email was, Ted, I'm eating crow. And it was his way of apologizing for the judgment he had that was based upon his own ignorance. And I applaud him for his willingness to admit that he made a mistake. I've also had doctors that have called me crying because they finally realized that they have spent years in their profession harming their own patients.
You know, that's the reaction I would expect somebody with a heart to have. If they do not cry and feel extremely terrible to a point where I think I would commit suicide. If I had to learn one day that I have injured thousands of my patients because of something that I forced on them. Because let's be honest here for a second. That's not in your book. That's kind of a tangent, but they are not. You have to be ready for a war. My son is unvaccinated. My wife and I both agree that nothing's ever going to go in. Nothing's ever going to be injected in my son. I know the horror stories. I know the facts, and I know more than doctors. At least I admit to know more than them. They probably do too, but that's beside the point. The point I'm making, though, is that you're going to need to be ready for a war. If you want to not vaccinate your children, if you want to not be vaccinated, be ready to explain yourself and shop around for doctors, because it's not going to be simple. You're going to be treated a very different way if you don't agree with them and you question them. They don't like to be questioned. That is from personal experience, and it doesn't matter where you are. I've traveled the US and I traveled Canada. Start questioning them and make it sound like you know more than them, they're going to push back and they're not going to be interested in dealing with you. But if you learn that you have potentially injured thousands of children, thousands of your patients, and you're not crying, asking God for forgiveness, do you really care that much?
Nico, you've just underscored my point that I don't believe informed consent happens with vaccination. Because when you say thank you, but no thank you, I've done my homework and I'm not interested, you get attacked, you get vilified, you get shamed, you might be removed from the doctor's practice. They say, I don't want to work with you. That's not informed consent. That's coercion. That's extortion. And I didn't really understand what informed consent looked like until my elderly mother, when she was in her early 80s, asked if I would go to the doctor with her because she was considering major heart surgery. And the doctor very carefully explained the surgery. He explained the condition she had. He explained the risks involved in her undergoing a general anesthetic. And he was very honest with her about the likelihood of her coming out unscathed, the likelihood of her dying on the operating table, the likelihood of her never coming out of, post-surgery. And he said, I don't want your answer today. I want you to go home and think about this. I want you to talk to your family and then come back and tell me what your decision is. And I just thought, wow, I've never seen a medical decision so clearly presented and the responsibility for the decision given to the patient to make that decision. It shocked me. And then that's what helped me to realize that practice of so-called informed consent does not happen with vaccination. They simply assume that you're going to do it, roll up your sleeve. It's now time for your child to have 6 vaccines or 8 vaccines or 10 vaccines. When that baby is born, they take that baby away from you. They put a couple of needles into the arm and give the baby back to you. No conversation, no ability to weigh the risks versus the benefits. And again, I believe that our system is not only unethical, it's actually criminal, because the evidence is so compelling now that even one vaccine increases your risk of a lifetime chronic illness. And that is never explained or almost never explained to patients.
I would take it a step even further. It is evil. What we do, what the medical system does to our children is absolutely evil. The fact that I have to defend my child against them is absolutely ludicrous. The fact that I had to sleep in the EQ with him, yet when he was born, because I did not trust them. I did not trust the doctors and the nurses not to do injections when I wasn't around. So instead of being with my wife, helping her recuperate, I was sleeping on a lawn chair right next to my child, and I was the only parent to do so. And there was probably 20 other babies in there, and I was the only one. This is how indoctrinated we are as a culture, that we are okay with leaving a newborn unattended under the supervision of complete strangers. You don't even need to consider the vaccination portion of it. But this is how indoctrinated we are to trust those people, when clearly COVID showed us that they cannot be trusted. And I had a conversation with Mark Trozy, and I asked him that question: are you ashamed of being a doctor? And I don't know, and he's not, and I understand why. I wasn't trying to trap him, because I thought he did the right thing. But if you don't support a guy like that, do you really care? Because he did the right thing when it mattered.
Yeah, he recognized that the vaccine wasn't proven safe or effective, and he called that out, and he asked questions about it. And for doing that, that's what a responsible doctor does. That's what an ethical doctor does. They took his license away from him. And if you ask him now, would he like to have his license returned to him? He's saying, I don't want to work for that profession. It's a club I don't want to belong to anymore. It's, you know, I think I'm with you that I think that the practice of vaccination, and it's not just vaccinations. You look at other medical products that are being pushed upon the general population, and when you actually begin to do the research, when you learn to read the product information monographs that every product has, and you see the gaps in the safety testing, it's more than irresponsible. It is criminal behavior. You know, what most people don't understand is the average pharmaceutical product is tested between 3 and 10 years before it's licensed for use, because it takes that long to gather sufficient evidence to determine a reasonable amount of safety and efficacy. And even then, products are removed from the market once they're in amongst the general population because of harm. Thalidomide is a good example of that. That was given to pregnant moms for morning sickness, and it caused the babies to be born without limbs. What I would suggest all doctors don't know, and parents don't know, thus don't know, is that vaccines are tested for a couple of days or a couple of weeks. The longest safety trial of the vaccine on the childhood schedule is 4 weeks. The shortest safety trial is 48 hours. I can't understand how any licensing body would find that acceptable. And so it's not just the pharmaceutical industry, it's our regulatory agencies, it's Health Canada, it's the CDC that allows a completely different standard of testing, of safety testing with vaccinations than with any other pharmaceutical product. And what you and I both know is that in the United States, and it actually impacts Canadians, is that in 1986, the vaccine industry was granted legal immunity for injury and death caused by their products. They are the only product sold in America where they're not liable for injury and death caused by their products. Why would we allow that? Why would we accept that? And yet we do. In Canada, we don't have that same 1986 Act, but we have that. You have to prove both causation and negligence in Canada in order to be successful with a vaccine injury claim. And even when you prove causation, if a physician follows the recommended Health Canada schedule, you can't hold them accountable for negligence. And so it's impossible to hold the vaccine industry, to hold the pharmaceutical industry, doctors accountable when vaccines injure and kill, as they did to my son.
You're bringing up a good point, because the biggest problem that I see in the vaccine industry is on all sides, on the medical doctors and big pharma itself, is the lack of accountability, that they cannot be held accountable for their actions. Can you imagine how fast things would change if a doctor was found guilty of negligence and was not only losing its license, but ending up in jail for 20 years? I guarantee you that that would set the record straight for all the other doctors out there. And maybe I need to be more educated on the type of products that I recommend my patients, because now there's real tangible consequences. And I don't know of any other field outside of medicine where they can get away with a mechanic that would put a faulty piece in your car and you end up getting injured.
Right.
They're gonna get sued. They're gonna be in trouble. They might have criminal negligence. The medical field is about the only field that I can think off the top of my head that has protection outside of politicians, outside of the crown protection as we know in politics, but they're all the same. They are protected, no accountability. Why would they change?
Well, Nico, and you've identified it. So look at automobiles. If a car manufacturer was not liable if that car performs in a way that's dangerous, why would they care about the safety of their vehicle? But what we see happen is that there's constant recalls because they say, oh, there's a problem with the tie rod, or there's a problem with this recall. Millions of vehicles get recalled because the manufacturer will get sued. They'll be held accountable for the injury or death caused by a defective product. That doesn't happen with vaccines. There is, as you said, zero accountability. And so, before 1986, it was a handful of vaccines that were recommended for children. When the liability protection came in 1986, that was a massive win for the pharmaceutical industry. Now they could produce a product and they had zero risk of liability. And then they convinced governments to mandate their products. So now the products are required by every child to go to school. And for example, in provinces like Ontario and New Brunswick here in Canada. And if a child gets injured or killed, there's no consequence to the vaccine industry. Like, they must have had one heck of a celebration in 1986. And as a result, the number of vaccines on the schedule tripled within a short period of time. Parents, sometimes I'll hear people will say, well, Ted, I got vaccines as a kid and that was no big deal. They don't understand. What I say to parents today is that if you're about 36 years of age or older, you've received fewer vaccines in your lifetime than a 6-month-old baby today. They don't understand that a child that is following the recommended or mandated vaccine schedule in America or Canada, up to age 18, there's a minimum of 72 vaccines. And if you include COVID vaccines once or twice a year, could be as many as 100 vaccines before the age of 18. If you were to survey the average population, they would not guess that.
No, unless you're a parent, because I've already seen it. My son's 10 months old and I would have to calculate, but I would say he would have taken at least 10 by now.
Right.
And he's 6 like that. And we haven't seen the doctor since he's 6 months. We're not going to go back for another few months until he's 1 year old. But he would have taken more vaccines that I remember taking in my lifetime.
Exactly.
And you're talking about a 6 months old. You're talking about a tiny little thing that still fits in my hands.
Well, and what we know in terms of the development of an infant, the brain, the neurological system, and the immune system are growing rapidly in the first 4 to 5 years of life. And that is when most of the vaccines are administered. And vaccines they contain toxic substances. They contain ingredients that we deem to be neurotoxic, to be poisonous. And if vaccines aren't labeled, the ingredients aren't labeled for parents to look at. I mean, I find it really curious about how a young parent will do hours and hours of research on a baby stroller or a baby crib or a car seat, or when they go to the grocery store, they pick up that baby infant formula or baby food and they read the ingredients, and good for them. That's being a responsible parent. But I would suggest to you less than 1% of the population read the ingredients of a vaccine product. We naively and blindly trust that whatever's in that needle is okay. And what parents don't understand, what almost everybody doesn't understand, including health professionals, is the body is not designed to receive those kinds of toxins through an injection. The natural defense mechanism of the body is in your mouth, in your nose, in your digestive tract, in your lungs, because that's how we encounter pathogens typically in day-to-day life. We breathe it in, or we take it in through our mouth or through drinking. And so all of our defense mechanism, that's where the sentries are, that's where the guards are that alert the body to say, there's an intrusion here. We need to rise up and defend against this invasion. When you poke something into your baby's thigh or into their forearm, the defense mechanism isn't there. That's not where it is. And if you were to simply inject, let's say, polio virus, if in fact it really exists, into the arm of an infant, the body would just ignore it. And so what the vaccine industry has to do to alert the immune system that there's a problem is they have to put in something that's toxic. And that's why they put in aluminum and mercury, because those are the most toxic substances. So mercury is considered to be the most toxic substance on the planet that's not radioactive. And we're injecting that into our day-old infants. Any thoughtful parent would immediately say no to that. And the fact they're not saying no is because they're not told. And that's why, and the medical system will not educate you. Our regulatory agencies will not educate you, or media will not educate you. So it takes an organization like Vaccine Choice Canada to educate parents.
And I agree. That's why I love working with you guys, because I completely what you guys are doing. And going back to the original question, or to the original comment, your three-legged analogy, your three-legged stool analogy is the perfect one that should apply to pretty much every decision that you make in life, not just medical decision making. Is it necessary? Is it safe? Does it work?
Yeah.
It's really not. It's a brilliant analogy. Absolutely brilliant analogy, because if one of the three simple questions ends up being a no, all three become a no.
That's right. That's right. Any one of those legs and the stool fails. And I would suggest to you that none of those legs can stand when you actually do your homework on vaccination. No vaccine on the childhood schedule has proven to be safe. None. And again, if a parent simply understood that, the answer would be no, thank you. I'm not interested. But instead of actually providing the evidence, providing the science, what we get marketing propaganda. Vaccines are safe and effective. Vaccines save millions of lives. Vaccines are a miracle of modern medicine. Each of those statements is a lie. Massive deception. But if you repeat a lie over and over and over again, people begin to think that it's the truth.
Even the first one, you don't even need to go that far, because is it necessary compared to what? Getting sick? What is the only type of protection you can achieve that is 100% effective? Natural immunity. There's no vaccine that can promise you 100%. None of them. None of them can. Only getting sick and letting your immune system do its job, fight the infection, can actually give you 100% immunity. So is it necessary? No. Is it safe? You can argue, compared to what? A bullet to the brain? Like, what is it safe? What are we comparing it to? And same thing, does it work? Does it work compared to what?
Right.
Because that's the question too, right? Because you could say, is it necessary? Sure, it is. Okay, you can argue, yes, it is. Is it safe? Yes, it is. Does it work? Yes, it worked. But compared to what?
Right. How do you measure success? And what you discover with the vaccine industry, success is not measured on improved health. It's measured on the number of vaccine doses that you get. And so it's the measurement is already biased in favor of the pharmaceutical industry. If you actually measure health, and I said this a few minutes ago, is that every vaccinated versus unvaccinated study shows that children that are unvaccinated have greater health than vaccinated children. There was a study that was done in 2020, the control group study, that looked at the risk of dying, the risk of mortality. And they discovered that the risk of dying is higher for every vaccine on the childhood schedule than being unvaccinated. And so, parents think that they're protecting their child from dying. They're actually putting their child at risk.
One of the things that I really enjoyed about your book, and I found it quite ironic considering that I lost my career as a sales engineer for not taking the vaccine, for refusing to take the COVID vaccine, I really had never considered the impact of vaccine mandates on career path. I would never thought, that's why it's so ironic. I never considered that when I studied, for example, was going in technology. It never occurred to me that maybe I shouldn't go down that path, because you know what? They will ask me to take so-called medicine that I don't agree with that could potentially harm me. And this is the reality of kids now, of young adults, and I would argue teenagers, that they really need to start thinking about this seriously, because it's not getting better. As we speak right now, there's more and more vaccines. There are more and more so-called recommendation, but it is in pure insanity that this is something that our youth have to consider. If you want to go down a specific career path, you need to consider what they're going to ask you to do to yourself in order to belong.
Nico, that's exactly that was one of the priorities for this book. And one of the reasons is that we started to hear from young people that had put in 3 or 4 years of university education, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars, only to discover that they would not be allowed to graduate unless they were fully vaccinated. And they would ask, what can we do? And at that point, there's nothing you can do. You either give up your bodily sovereignty and hope that the vaccines don't cause too much harm, or you step away from that investment and that career path. And so we want to get to young people to help them understand there are certain career paths that will violate your right to bodily sovereignty. And they are typically the medical profession, and they've expanded it. So almost any career in the medical profession, whether it's a doctor, nurse, dental assistant, sometimes even administrators or assistants in offices of medical clinics, are being required to be fully vaccinated. In the travel industry, they sometimes require that you be fully vaccinated, with even more vaccines that are on the childhood schedule. There's a whole bunch of travel vaccines, and we need to talk about creating a book around that. You join the military, and you give up all right to say no to your whatever they want to put into your body. And there's a long history of the pharmaceutical industry experimenting with vaccines on military personnel because they can't say no. We want to stop, that violation, and we want to help young people understand that before they put in 3 or 4 years of an education and hundreds of thousands of dollars. And that's why I think it might be grandparents who are the ones that are handing this book to their 19 or 20-year-old grandson or granddaughter and saying, you need to understand this, and I'm unwilling to fund a career path that's going to violate your right to bodily sovereignty. In our book, we have a number of stories that we tell, and some of the stories are of young people that took the vaccine and became harmed or killed. Sean Hartman is a good example of that. I think you've interviewed Dan Hartman. The other one is that, again, you get to the end of your university education, and when it's time to place you in a practicum setting, they say, none of these settings will accept you unless you're fully vaccinated, so you can't complete the final requirements to graduate. And so one of the stories is about somebody who had to step away from 4 years of university because they were unwilling to subject themselves to a whole battery of vaccines. And they do it all at once. They just give you 15 or 20 at the same time. Like, it's, from a medical perspective, it's absolute lunacy, but that's what happens. And so we want to reach young people to understand the seriousness of that career decision and where it may get compromised by what's being imposed upon them by universities. The other thing we discovered in this process, Nico, is our team contacted about 15 different universities across Canada. and spoke to the, the intake office or the registration office, admissions office for the university or college, and we asked them what their vaccine mandates are. And almost every one of them said, oh, we don't have any mandates. And it was only through the process where we would start to say, well, but, do you have a requirement for a practicum placement for vaccination? Oh, yeah, we do. So then are you letting your students at admission know that somewhere along the path that's going to be required? No, we don't do that. And so we discovered that none of the universities in Canada were honest with people that are applying for admission to the universities about the requirements that they would face at some point on that career path. And I find that incredibly dishonest. And again, I would use the language criminal. I think it's fraudulent. I get people reaching out to me all the time saying my son or my daughter, my grandson or my granddaughter wants to become a doctor, nurse, chiropractor, midwife. I mean, any of those professions, and they're demanding vaccination. What should I do? And my answer to them is you need to step away from that profession if you want to maintain your right to bodily sovereignty. If you're willing to give it up and saying whatever's required of me in order to maintain my profession, go ahead. But I think that's a very dangerous practice, because it's not only what vaccines are required today, what might they require tomorrow? And again, we saw with COVID, they imposed the COVID vaccine as a requirement for continued licensing, and hundreds, if not thousands, of health professionals in this country lost their license to practice their profession because they refused to participate in an experimental vaccination program.
So that's great for the kids that are not quite, and when I say kids, I'm just anybody that's younger than me is a kid, basically. So any young adult that is already aware of this, or that's becoming aware that depending on their career path, they might have to reconsider. What happens to the people that are in school right now that never realized that was even a possibility because they were not informed? They were not informed. They were lied to. Let's use the proper word here. They were lied to.
Yes.
What type of exemptions can they get?
Well, technically, there are exemptions for personal belief and religious exemptions. What I can tell you, and for medical exemptions, what I can tell you is that those are almost never honored. They're very easily dismissed. The appeal, it's very subjective. There's no rigorous process, and you would think that should be an automatic, that if I say, my personal belief is that this is not in my best interest, it's not healthy for me, that should be accepted. And in a society that actually believes and enforces informed consent, that would be the end of the conversation. It's not. Again, we hear regular stories of students that when they are confronted with that requirement that in order to graduate, in order to be licensed, you have to receive X, Y, and Z vaccines. They apply for a personal belief or religious exemption, and it gets denied. And our court system defers to health authorities. I mean, there's been dozens and dozens, probably hundreds of cases that have happened over the last 5 years of people that have gone to court because their right to informed consent, their right to making a medical decision for themselves, has been violated. And our courts, our human rights tribunals, with very few exceptions, have deferred to health authorities and completely violated the fundamentals of a free and democratic society.
So in other words, there's not a lot they can do if they're already engaged in, let's say, a 4-year program or a 3-year program, if they do want to keep their bodily autonomy.
Well, for the most part, they're caught between a rock and a hard spot. What I'm aware of is that some of the solutions have been people will move to an area that don't require vaccine mandates. And so there are states, for example, in the United States that are much more, in my view, affirming of bodily sovereignty and individual rights. And so you can be licensed as a health practitioner or practice in those areas without being following all of the so-called recommended vaccines. And so some people move. Some people have to choose a different profession. And so instead of being a frontline health practitioner, they might be a clerk in an office. They might be, somebody, the new medical system seems to be telemedicine, where you call in and somebody, answers the phone and gives you medical advice. The bottom line is that your ability to practice the profession that you have chosen is being compromised by bureaucrats, and those requirements are not fixed at a point in time. They change on a regular basis. And so in BC here, they've just passed new legislation that allows the government to dictate the requirements for annual licensing of every health profession in the province. If you're a speech therapist, they get to decide whether you need to have vaccines or not to maintain your license. I think, BC is not a province that I would encourage anybody who wants to be in the health profession to practice in. I think that a health professional has no right in this province. They're subjected to the whims of the bureaucrats, and that's not a profession I'd want to be in.
One last thing I wanted to talk about before we put an end to this episode is we've mentioned a few times that this book would be a great asset for parents and grandparents. And I think that one of the story that you have in the book about Neil, there's no last name, but a teenager that turned 18, and for the first time in his life, he went to the doctors without his parents. He went there as an adult, and his parents naively maybe, but you can tell that it wasn't their, like, they did not think about it twice. They just, he's a big boy now, he's 18, time for responsibilities, so he's gonna go to the doctor by himself. Turns out that during that visit, his yearly visit, he was injected twice, and one of the vaccine had been something that they had refused in the past, just a year later, and he became very sick and ended up dying. This is a great story. As much as I don't like to say it's a great story, because this is a very sad story and I can't imagine what they've been through as the parents, but that is one of those stories that should really cement the idea in parents' head that it is their job to educate their children to make sure that they are ready to face those type of questions, because as an adult, you will be heckled, you will be bullied. I think bullied is the perfect word. You will be bullied by doctors and nurses to take a vaccine, and often people just say yes to shut down.
Nico, you raise a really important point here. It's not enough just for a parent to decide not to vaccinate their son or their daughter. They actually need to educate and explain to that young adult how the decision was made and why the decision was made, because that young adult is going to be pressured for the rest of their life to accept medical products and not just vaccines. And if you don't know how to make a medical decision, if you don't know how to evaluate risk versus benefit, if you don't know how to do that calculation, you're going to be subject to the propaganda of the pharmaceutical industry, and they're masterful in their propaganda. And so I'm aware of situations just like you described, where a child is unvaccinated, the parents made that conscious decision, and then there's just a moment where whether that person turns to the age of consent, but even before that, where because of the mature minor doctrine, they are cornered by a doctor or a public health nurse at school, and they're told they can make their own decision, and they succumb to a vaccine, and there's a life consequence for that. I tell parents that you need to teach your children as young as 9 years of age. If people show up at school with needles, you come home. You don't stick around. You're in a very vulnerable situation. And they take advantage of that vulnerability. They take advantage of peer pressure, of social conformity. They know exactly what they're doing, Nico. And the fact that this isn't deemed criminal is criminal. I believe there should be no vaccine clinics in schools. That it should. That's a medical practice that should be done by a health professional who knows the family history, because it's not just the individual's medical history that's important. It's also the family history. And I would suggest a 9-year-old, a 12-year-old, a 16-year-old, even a 20-year-old may not know what the family's medical history is, and their own vulnerability to being injured or killed by a vaccine product or other medical product. We are far too naive and far too blindly trusting of the pharmaceutical industry. And we need to understand is that what's being injected into our infants has not been tested, has not been proven to be safe. And if again, you know what it's like to be a parent, you will die to protect your child, and yet they have been able to bypass that natural protective tendency of 99% of parents who allow something to be injected into their infant that they absolutely have no knowledge of. And often, what often happens, Nico, is that parents don't begin to take responsibility for that decision until somebody's been hurt. And then, unfortunately, it's too late.
And you're the perfect example to speak about this exactly.
Yeah. I'm guilty of that. I blindly, naively walked into that doctor's office with my 4-month-old baby, and I didn't ask any questions. I didn't do any research, and it's only as a result of his injury and now his death that I'm committed to doing what I'm doing.
And it's mentioned in your book that none of those, and I'm paraphrasing here, none of the stories are good stories, but if they can teach you something, maybe they were I don't even know the proper word to say. I don't want to say they were worth it, because they definitely weren't, but you know what I'm trying to say. I'm not sure how to phrase this properly.
Well, let me tell you what we've learned over 44 years of doing this work is that evidence by itself doesn't seem to change minds. Facts don't change minds. What people seem to remember, or what impacts them, is stories. Because I think that in addition to the intellect, that there also needs to be a heart engagement, and so the stories do that. You remember stories in a way that you don't remember facts. And so it's one of the reasons that we've very intentionally told stories in this book, and we've had young parents, young people tell us their stories so that we can pass those stories on to others.
Ted, thank you once again for what you do through Vaccine Choice Canada. I'm very happy that we met. I'm very happy that we get to work with each other. I'm happy that we're going to see each other at the end of the month at the Better Way Conference in Rhode Island. I'm really looking forward to that. But thank you for what you do, and thank you for your organization.
Well, Nico, thank you. And one of the things I appreciate is that your passion to understand this subject and then share it with others, and particularly younger parents, so that we can have more healthy kids than we've got now. So thank you for everything you're doing.
It's a no-brainer to me, Ted. Thank you very much. And guys in the comments section, thank you very much for being here. I'll see you guys in about an hour. Until then, Ted, enjoy the rest of your day, and we shall see you soon.
We will. I look forward to it.